talk about all these challenges with U.S. companies decoupling from China. Like you can't do it immediately. If it even happens, it's a long-term process. But I've also heard you talk about in interviews on other shows that China is actively decoupling from the U.S. So what's happening there?
Yeah, that's right. Well, part of the whole idea of the Belt and Road was to create an alternate economic bloc so that China didn't have to be dependent on what it considers its enemy, which is us. There's also the dual circulation policy, which is official policy of China, which essentially says we're going to build up our domestic industries while luring the foreigners in to teach us how to build up our industries. And once our industries can be independent, we'll kick all these people out. But that's official policy. Now,
Where are we in that cycle now?
well, one of the things that they can't produce themselves is energy. They're deeply energy reliant. So they need shipments of Australian energy and Saudi, for instance, or Iran, very important supplier, Russia. So again, they can decouple from us on low-end things like clothing or higher-end manufacturing like cars. They produce, serviceable electric vehicles and cars, but they need energy to run their economy, and that is a very weak point. And that's why I think you see that no limits partnership with Russia and the massive economic deal they did with Tehran just in these last years is to ensure that supply comes from friendly places and not from us.
Right. Well, they can get oil from Iran and Russia, and they can probably get refined uranium for their nuclear plants from Russia as well.
Yeah, this is something else that they really don't want us to talk about, which is the significant military buildup, right? We don't have access to their nuclear facilities. It was something that we tried to get during the Trump era to no avail. But if you think about it, I mean, million-man army, world's largest navy, third largest air force, biological chemical weapons programs, daily cyber attacks. They attack our satellites daily. They cut our Pacific cables, done that several times. You need to add it all up. This is the sort of stuff we need to be talking about. Asymmetric capabilities to take down our aircraft carriers. I mean, it's a really long list, and that's what I tell clients. Actually, you don't just witness the kind of military they're building. What its purpose is. It's not to defend China. It's to subjugate us. Look at how they've used it as they've built it. They've become more aggressive toward their people and others. And then look at what they say they're going to do in the future. And the United Front activities, again, just to pull us back to the topic, one of the main points is to prevent us from talking about this stuff. They don't want us talking about it. They want us talking about win-win trade, right? Just forget the human rights stuff, forget the military buildup, just focus us on these dialogues and this economic relationship, and just forget all the other things. That's something that we really need to fight.
Yeah, I'm thinking of all of the experts who said, "Oh, it's a great thing if we move all of our manufacturing to China." And then as, small town America was like getting completely gutted, the experts were like, "Look at how much GDP is going up. This is great."
Yeah, it's true, and it's a big factor, I think, in Trump's election. I think we're going to look back on this period and ask, where did our common sense go? Forget the name China. When did it ever make sense to base all of your manufacturing in a single place? And then in a place that has no independent boards or property protections, or where you have board members who are party members shoved on you, and you have to include them in decision making. When did that ever make sense? That was insane. A long time ago, James Mann wrote a book called The China Fantasy, where he asked all these questions. And I thought that you go back and you read it now and you just think, wow, that was really, really
That was like 20
prescient.
years ago, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there were folks out there who got it a long time ago, and we've got to give them credit. That bell was being, rung.
A few weeks ago, Chris, this was when you were out at the martial arts competition. We had Matt Turpin on our show, and he was talking about how, and I hadn't quite heard it put this way before, but he was talking about how having been in both commerce and like the National Security Council, he was talking about how he felt that essentially what had happened with this whole like push towards moving manufacturing to China, like helping Chinese economy, is that the government policy of the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, was to help China's economy. Like that was their mandate for like over 20 years. And I hadn't heard it put like that before, but yes, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and look, it did have a positive impact. I mean, we did get cheaper stuff. We can't ignore that. That did happen. However, everything is a risk and return, right? And I think what we're realizing is that the downside of that policy, the impact on American workers, the increased threat to our national security by enriching a totalitarian, paranoid regime like this should have been recognized much earlier. But remember, just prior to 9/11, what was the big threat that the US government was going to focus on? It was China. Remember when the Chinese downed one of our spy planes over Hainan Island, and then they pulled everybody out and beat them up a little bit, and kept them for, I don't know, more than a week, I think. Maybe it was even a couple of weeks before George W. could get them out. Had 9/11 never happened, we might have figured this out more than 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I think I've definitely said that.
Well, oops. So we're in this place now where the U.S. is not really on board yet with pulling out, although some companies are. The CCP already is starting to do its own type of decoupling in some ways. But at the same time, the Chinese economy is not doing well. They're beset by crises on all fronts, whether it's real estate, banking and debt, unemployment, and energy crises, water crises. The CCP still is reliant heavily on foreign direct investment. So how can they decouple without completely losing everything from an already tight spot?
We should say a couple of things in no particular order. The first is that we are really bad at predicting significant political change in closed regimes. We missed the Arab Spring. We didn't predict the Iranian freedom movement, not once but twice, the movement in Cuba, the fall of the Soviet Union. Whoops, surprise, right? So we could wake up tomorrow and Xi Jinping could be gone. I mean, that is entirely possible. We have no insight into what's going on in the Chinese leadership. So we always have to play that. Secondly, but let's assume that they do stay in power. One of the things that you're raising is, from our point of view, how can you stay in power with people suffering to this extent? And that is a slight case of something I call strategic narcissism. We assume that their values are our values, but it's not. They don't value human life. It doesn't matter. I mean, look at the North Korean regime and how many decades it survived with an impoverished, oppressed people. That's part of the reason why the PLA has been built up and the internal security services are larger than the PLA. It's to prevent people, to scare them into submission. One of my pet peeves is this ridiculous argument that there's some sort of tacit bargain, right? Implicit bargain between the government and the people. And if they better the Chinese people's lives, then, the people willingly give up, their aspirations. That's nonsense. There's no bargain. It's just a brutal regime that oppresses people and scares them into submission. So, I guess the real question is, how long can they do that, right? Do they have the resources to suppress a population this large, because it's much bigger than North Korea? And do they have the resources to keep going, right? Can they get their supplies from Russia and Iran? I don't know, but one of the challenges that, freedom-loving people in China have, and there are a lot of them, is that unlike places like, say, Iran, that has a very where you have many kind of educated people, and you've got kind of a regime in waiting, and you have institutions outside of the country that can kind of come in should that country ever become free again. You don't really have that in China. There's no coherent kind of government in waiting. There's no civil institutions within China. They've all been eviscerated. So, it's to make sure that even if this leader falls, it would be very hard for a democracy to develop in mainland China. I'm not saying it's impossible. It would just be very difficult. So it's, it's sad, right? Because the Chinese people are so wonderful, and they share many characteristics in common with Americans. And imagine how much better off not just the region but the world would be if you had a free China. It would transform our world.